Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a brand new episode of the Word of the Day podcast. My name is Jamie Silva, I'm your host, and I am quite contented to be back behind the mic once again, pleasantly explaining another useful word to you all. Today's word is the verb exacerbate, which has a simple, easy-to-remember definition. That is, to make something, usually a problem or bad situation, worse. So, for example, if you were chopping some onions and they were making your eyes smart, and you instinctively rubbed your eyes with an oniony hand, well, they'd hurt even more. Hence, you could say, ow, that really exacerbated the pain, right? Like you took something that was already bad and made it worse. The Google definition agrees with mine, though I don't get too much credit for this because the meaning is pretty straightforward. Quote, to make a problem, bad situation, or negative feeling worse, unquote. Now, exacerbate is frequently confused with, or at least pronounced as, the verb exasperate, which means to intensely irritate, frustrate, or annoy. The confusion makes sense in a way, since not only do the two words sound very similar, but exasperation is a negative feeling, and it's easy to imagine that it makes stuff worse somehow. Also, in defense of folks who mix them up, per Merriam-Webster, hundreds of years ago, the two words meant basically the same thing. That is, to make more grievous or to make harsh or harsher. Exacerbate has essentially kept this meaning, while exasperate has shifted. Their Latin roots are also nearly identical. The Latin verb exacerbare, and, just FYI, in classical Latin, the letter C was never soft like an S, as it often is in English. Rather, it was always hard, like a K. Therefore, again, this verb, while spelled with a C, technically would have been said something like exacerbare. Continuing, this meant to irritate, provoke, or, funnily enough, exasperate, while the separate verb exasperare meant to roughen, irritate, or provoke. Deconstructing these two even further, exacerbare was formed from the Latin word acerbus, meaning harsh or bitter, while exasperare was formed from the adjective asper, which meant rough or harsh, and was often used to describe sour wine, bad weather, and hard times. And if you've got sour wine and bad weather together, it's certainly not a good time. So, in summary, lots of conceptual and historical connection between these two words. And who knows, if people keep saying exasperate when they mean exacerbate, maybe dictionaries will have to gradually adapt, and their definitions will shift to accommodate what started as an error. Since that's how it works. Dictionaries adapt to actual usage, leaving folks who say what words are supposed to mean or used to mean in the dust. Moving along to a couple usage notes for exacerbate. First, this word is most often used in situations where someone is trying to fix something, but mistakenly contributes to the problem somehow. Hence my onion example earlier. Or, to keep it in the kitchen while raising the stakes, think about pouring water onto a grease fire. Rather than putting it out, the water will exacerbate the flames, potentially turning them into a blazing inferno. This is a common scenario, not grease fires to be clear, just generally making stuff worse. And it applies basically any time you hear someone say, "I was only trying to help," which usually means that they have just exacerbated or potentially created a problem. Now, this reminds me, and this will be a little bit of a tangent, but it is relevant. It reminds me of this idea in economics called the law of unintended consequences, which, as far as economics jargon goes, is actually pretty intuitive. This law is the notion that when policymakers intervene in the free market in order to correct a real or perceived market failure, there are often negative consequences that they couldn't or didn't foresee, and they certainly didn't intend. For example, when there's a natural disaster in some area, like, say, a hurricane, there's often a lamentable lack, or a dearth, harkening back to episode 86, there is a dearth of essential goods, like water and gas. So, stores and gas stations raise their prices on those things, sometimes by a lot. This practice is often decried as price gouging, taking advantage of desperate, thirsty people and exploiting them in their time of need, by making them pay through the nose for stuff that's ordinarily pretty cheap. This sad situation often leads local politicians who want to be helpful, or at least to be seen as helpful, to impose price controls, under which prices for certain basic goods are capped at what is usually called a fair rate. These controls are intended to ensure that more people can purchase the essentials they need. So far, so well-intentioned. But here's where the law of unintended consequences comes in. When prices for a good are capped at an artificially low rate, suppliers of that good have less of an incentive to offer it for sale. And so they offer less of it, instead probably shipping that good to other places where it can command a higher price. Hence, in the afflicted area, thanks to the price controls, essentials are often scarcer than ever, and even fewer people have access to them. So, voila, problem exacerbated. This phenomenon, by the way, is why you often see in countries with a lot of price controls pictures of shelves in stores that are just empty. This doesn't necessarily mean that the country is unable in some way to produce the goods. It's more likely that suppliers are simply prevented from offering them at a price that would allow them to turn a profit due to price controls. Moving along, there's another famous example of unintended consequences, of politicians trying to harness market incentives to solve a problem, but actually exacerbating it instead. The tale comes from India, back when it was under British colonial rule. See, the British government was concerned about all these venomous cobras slithering around the city of Delhi, and so they offered a reward for anyone who could prove that they killed one. Sure enough, enterprising locals were soon turning in large numbers of dead cobras, and claiming the per-snake prize. But after a few weeks of this, somehow, the snake population in Delhi seemed higher than ever. The reason? Well, thanks to the reward, people began breeding cobras specifically to kill and then turn in. Upon discovering this scheme, British authorities immediately ended the bounty, hoping to also end the perverse incentive. Which it did, but there was one final act to this comedy of errors. With no hope of further profits, all those new snake breeders just released their cobras back into the city, further exacerbating the original snake plague. This unfortunate saga gave rise to the term the cobra effect, a type of unintended consequence in which an attempted solution actually worsens/exacerbates the problem. Now, in addition to people trying to fix things, problems can also be worsened by a neutral, impersonal force. For example, one might say that the mountains of Spain were already pretty dry, but lately the rain in Spain has stayed mainly on the plain, which has exacerbated those dry, arid conditions in the high country. Here, nobody is controlling those plain-staying Spanish rains, but the drought was worsened all the same. And now it's time for another tangent. This one isn't relevant to exacerbate at all, it just amuses me to no end, so I'm going to share it with you. So many of you will recognize that rain in Spain phrase as a reference to My Fair Lady, the famous movie/musical/play. Here's the line in question from the film.
All right, Eliza, say it again.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
Didn't I say that?
No, Eliza, you didn't say that. You didn't even say that.
Okay, so I was just thinking while preparing this episode that it's surprisingly easy to do a Cockney or Australian accent, because they're pretty similar, actually, especially in the vowels. It's not at all difficult to do an accent for that line. All you do is say each word with an I sound instead of an A sound. So even someone like me, who I'm bad at accents, I don't do them. Even I think, can pull this off. Judge for yourself. The Rhine in Spine stays mainly on the plain. Not bad, right? And it gets even cooler. You can play little mind games with this, where if I think of the word for a backbone or vertebrae, and I say spine, that sounds normal in my head. There's no accent there. But if I think, okay, I'm going to say the name of that nation in Southwest Europe with that same sound, spine, the nation of spine, then it feels like an accent. It's so weird. Same thing for Rhine, by the way. I could be referring to the major European river of that name, Rhine, and that sounds normal, the Rhine River. Or I could be referring to precipitation, droplets from the sky, Rhine. Just like that, again, Australian. Amazing, isn't it? Now, as tempted as I am to let this success go to my head and do the rest of the show in an Aussie accent, Producer Pete, or as I now like to call him, Producer Pate, he tells me this would be a terrible idea, and for once, I'll take his advice. I will also, however, link in the show notes to a website I found called the Exacerbate, which promises to convert ordinary text into a phonetically spelled version of an Australian accent. Or, alternatively, an Irish or French or German, Austrian, Bostonian, Sean Connery, or Swedish chef accent. Hours of entertainment for the whole family. Anyway, that was fun. One other usage note for exacerbate. I'm not sure why this is, but you often see it paired with the words only, just, and merely, as in the sentence, taking a detour onto surface streets in order to avoid freeway rush hour traffic only exacerbated Claire's delay, as long stoplights lengthened her commute even more. So I think that only, just, and merely serve as intensifying words in this context, ways to underscore just how futile and counterproductive the attempted remedy is. Sort of like how someone might say, I thought bottling up my fears inside me would make them disappear, but not confronting them just made them worse. It's like you're saying, rather than anything positive coming out of this, the only result was exacerbating the problem. Okay, let's now get a couple examples of how to use exacerbate in ordinary conversation or writing. Example number 1. Don't worry about the leaky faucet, dear, said Mr. Beeford. With my trusty wrench and pliers, I'll have it tightened up in no time. But a couple wrong wrench turns exacerbated the trickle into a torrent, and Mrs. Beeford was forced to do some emergency mopping. Example number 2. Hoping to encourage her kids to tidy up their rooms more often, Mrs. Chapman offered a $1 prize to whoever displayed the cleanest room at the end of the day. Unfortunately, this led the kids to sneak into each other's rooms and strew the floor with clothes and toys, hoping by this sabotage to claim the prize for themselves. Their scheming exacerbated the messiness problem, but it also taught everyone a valuable lesson about the power of perverse incentives. Example number 3 comes from the book Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe. Quote, he received the paper very peevishly and was about to crumple it, apparently to throw it into the fire, when a casual glance at the design seemed suddenly to rivet his attention. In an instant his face grew violently red, in another as excessively pale. For some minutes he continued to scrutinize the drawing minutely where he sat. He said nothing, however, and his conduct greatly astonished me. Yet I thought it prudent not to exacerbate the growing moodiness of his temper by any comment. And finally, example number 4 comes from Alvin Journeyman by Orson Scott Card, lightly edited for clarity. Quote, I know we can trust Mr. Dogley, said the judge, but why exacerbate the temptation that must already afflict at least some of his deputies? Alvin laughed. What's so funny, Mr. Smith? Asked the judge. How everybody's pretending they know what in the world exacerbate means, replied Alvin. They all joined him in laughter. Unquote. Good one, Alvin. If only these folks had had the opportunity to listen to this here episode, then they wouldn't have to pretend. Okay, that'll do it for the examples, but that will not do it for today's show. Up first, we are delighted to feature some listener-submitted Tom Swifties. In this type of wordplay, which we introduced in episode 118 as part of our Word Games series, you create a statement and a speaker where the statement itself connects with or parallels the way in which that statement is set. So, for example, the thermostat is set too high, Tom said heatedly. The game, then, simply consists in making more of these. Now, alert listener Melanie, we are happy to say, found this game quite diverting, and brainstormed a magnificent collection of Tom Swifties, and sent them to us. Some you're probably going to have to stop and ponder for a few moments before the aha moment arrives, but the wait is worth it. They're exceptionally clever. I'll include the solutions/explanations in the show notes, but here we're just going to present these as Melanie sent them to us. Here we go. Why, you have the most splendid young deer I have ever seen. How do you manage to care for it so well? Asked Tom fawningly. It's so beautiful here in this bell tower, breathed Tom, inspired. To continue making this flying robot, please solder the 320 OHM resistor to the 16 microfarad capacitor, Tom droned on. Sir, I think people are going to have trouble reading that. You had better make the text darker and thicker, Tom said boldly. Do you really think you can trust Google to weight the results fairly? Asked Tom searchingly. Quick, you distract him, and I'll get the construction paper and glue out of the closet, whispered Tom craftily. If only I had some kind of tool I could use to get my feather quill out of this sand, Tom said pensively. And finally, one for you fans of the wizarding world. No matter what I do, I can't seem to get rid of this meddling kid. He's always there, thwarting my plans, said Tom Riddle, harried. Okay, folks, that'll do it for the Tom Swifties, and thank you again, Melanie, so very much for sending them to us. This episode has probably gone on long enough at this point. We certainly wouldn't want to exacerbate anyone's impatience or exasperate them by prolonging it further. So, on behalf of all of us here at the Word of the Day podcast, this is your host, Jamie Silva, saying so long, thank you for listening, and until next time, as always, have a great